All right.
Evening everyone, we're going to kick off in about 20 seconds. So all of those grabbing your drinks, please do so with great gusto. Okay, thanks all very much indeed for coming this evening. Welcome to the ResPublica tent. It's my first and last time in this wonderful tent, this conference, and I'm really taken by the washing line that's above us. So anyone that needs to scratch up on their washing before they get home, feel free to use it. We're going to be here for the next hour and a half, hearing from a distinguished panel of speakers, and this really is alongside economic growth, part of economic growth, one of the biggest issues that is obviously being discussed, being talked about, and on the agenda at conference, and no doubt we'll hear a lot more about it at 11 o'clock tomorrow during the Prime Minister's speech. But in order to give him a few more ideas, in order to maybe tweak his speech a little, we've got a fantastic group of 4 speakers for you this evening to stimulate some ideas before we go to some Q&A. And I'm really keen to get as many questions as possible from the floor, so I'll ask our contributors to keep their remarks tight to around 5 minutes. So first, it's my great pleasure to welcome George Freeman. George is the government's advisor on life sciences, has a huge history and knowledge of the subjects we're going to be talking about, works very, very closely with our fantastic Minister for Higher Education, David Willits. Great to have you here, George. 5 minutes on infrastructure.
Can you hear me at the back, or do I need this? I need this.
I need this, okay. Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here for several reasons. I would stand up, but I'm going to have keep in my face. A pleasure for several reasons. Firstly, it's the last of my 10 fringe events, and I'm now free from tonight. Secondly, because I think ResPublica and Philip and the team are the flame carriers for a really important vein of thinking in conservatism about civic renewal and about making markets and capitalism work for society and for communities. And because I'm passionate about infrastructure, and it's great to see that we've filled a room on infrastructure, which has not traditionally been the sexiest subject on the fringe. Why am I passionate about infrastructure? Well, 2 policy reasons and then some domestic and constituency reasons which blend. Firstly, because I think modern infrastructure is absolutely essential to our ability to lay the foundations for a sustainable recovery, a resilient economy, a competitive, world-class, globally competitive modern economy. And I think that in some areas of the country, mine particularly, we are trying to build a 21st century innovation economy on 19th century infrastructure, and it won't work. And secondly, because I think the questions which that throws up, how do you fund that infrastructure, how do you lead it, how do you get it led properly and effectively, raise some of the most important questions that we face in dealing with this crisis in the body politic. Questions about leadership, questions about how we get private finance to fund public goods, and questions about the appropriate vehicles that we need to create to drive a renaissance of private innovation to deliver public ends. It's late at the end of 2 hard days. I want to tell you a few stories. I used to sit on the board of the Greater Cambridge Partnership. I had a career before Parliament, 15 years of investing nearly 200 million of other people's money in a number of start-up companies. The Greater Cambridge Partnership Board is a group of local investors and companies that used to think about the Cambridge region. We had a delegation once from the Brownite Politburo. A car came up from London, some people from the, whatever it was then called, the Department for Trade and Industry. And it was great. They came to tell us about how many companies they'd formed, how many jobs they created in the Cambridgeshire region. And I sat for about 15 minutes listening to the PowerPoint slides from the RDA explaining how many jobs the government had created. And in the end, I could stand it no longer and stood up and interrupted and said, hang on a minute, you haven't created any jobs. The entrepreneurs and the business people in this community have created jobs, and they've done it without that much help from government. Actually, they've done it because there's a great university here, there's a fabulous cluster here, and what government really should be doing is asking itself why Cambridge is an inflationary hotspot of talent and entrepreneurship and growth when we have deprivation, drugs, poverty in Kings Lynn, Peterborough, Cromer, Yarmouth and Lowestoft, where we're spending hundreds of millions on anti-deprivation measures. If we had a proper regional infrastructure of fast growth, fast rail and decent roads and air links and broadband, we could spread the growth out across this region, and we could drive much more growth and much more revenue for the public services. I'll tell you another story. The Norwich Research Park, many of you may not be aware of, it's Europe's premier integrated life sciences cluster. Medicine, food science and environmental science and energy. It's 40 miles from Cambridge. From the rest of the world, Cambridge and Norwich are linked. They're one place. In America, in San Diego and Singapore, they would be one cluster. We're not even linked by a dual carriageway. The train link is non-stop, isn't a non-stop. It's a two-carriage, very old-fashioned chuf-chuf that goes through Thetford Forest. It's utterly ridiculous. Any business people coming into Stansted wanting to get to Norwich, Europe's premier life science cluster, it's just a joke, it's a turn-off. And I remember investors in Cambridge saying to me, George, there are companies, there's science in Norwich that we could turn into great companies, but I cannot spend the day trying to go 40 miles and back. We're holding ourselves back, and we should be very frustrated by it. So I'm passionate about infrastructure because of the potential to drive growth, but there's something else. For too long, our region in East Anglia has been treated by Whitehall as an overflow, a dumping ground for retirees and commuters, without any consideration for the infrastructure for a sustainable model of living. My constituency sits in the middle of Cambridge and Norwich. It's well below national average on family incomes. It's not rich Norfolk. It's very poor, and a lot of lower paid public sector employees and retirees and pensioners. And it ought to be an area where entrepreneurs between these two great centres of science and technology are living and working, living in villages, starting businesses. There could be a renaissance of small businesses out in our villages, converted farm buildings, people trading in the rural economy. There's a vision of a high-tech rural economy. The quality of life is there. The innovation and science is just up the road. It's ridiculous that this area is a rural backwater and languishing, and we're losing youngsters and talent because of it. And if we really want to build sustainable communities, and we want to put housing into East Anglia, we need to be thinking about a model of growth in which people can work closer to home, indeed from home, and be able to get easily and quickly to fast rail links, to fast air links, and have good broadband, and run and start globally competitive little businesses out in a rural economy. And I think that vision is perfectly possible, but it won't happen without infrastructure. And the infrastructure isn't going to come from the government. We need to get out of thinking that everything comes from Whitehall. And my third story, I addressed the Chamber of Commerce in Norfolk recently. We were talking about the Cambridge-Norwich Railway and how important it is to get investment. And I said, well, why don't we, rather than think about begging to government for the money, do what our Victorian forebears did and think about how we might fund it. And Charlie, I know, will touch on this in connection with Dover. There was a stunned silence at the idea that we in Norfolk might have to take responsibility for our own infrastructure and our own links. And I think this debate opens up some really interesting space. Government hasn't got the money anymore to fund all the things that we need across the board. But what it has got is the ability to be very creative with the balance sheet and shift the assets around. I'd like us to look at some radical measures like a regional rail company. Let's put the dysfunctional network rail structure together with the train operating company, give them a longer franchise, give them the ability to develop and plan the rail corridors. The Treasury estimate is £29 billion worth of development value along our rail corridors, which we're not using. We could create a FTSE 250 company overnight that has a long-term cash flow, long-term asset base, and could raise the private finance to invest in our infrastructure. We're going to have to be much bolder. If you walk 3 or 4 minutes that way, you find a statue to an incredible man, Joe Chamberlain, and that vision of radical 19th century urban renewal, leadership, philanthropic and commercial and local capitalist self-interest is exactly what ResPublica is all about. And I think we need to be much more bold in thinking about how we invest in the infrastructure for tomorrow.
George, thank you very, very much indeed. I'll move quickly to our next speaker, Charlie Elphicke. Charlie is the MP for Dover and Deal, but also a member of the Public Administration Select Committee. I think he's also a member of the executive of the 1992 committee. Not anymore, but we're delighted to have him. Charlie.
Thank you very much. I just want to pick up on some of the things that George was saying and develop them a bit further. Infrastructure is absolutely central for civic renewal. And let me just tell you the story about Dover and what I found as a candidate and the way the community could be energised around that ideal of civic renewal and the ability to take ownership. All of us talk as Conservatives about the idea of government enabling and facilitating and allowing people and individuals and communities to take responsibility. But there is a meaning of that beyond the rhetoric. When I was selected as a candidate back in about 2007, shortly after that, Gordon Brown manages to destroy the nation's finances finally, and he scoops up a whole load of assets to stick into his infamous car boot sale. The Met Office, the forests, which caused us a problem, but that was actually Gordon Brown's fault, people forget that, and also the Port of Dover. And they wanted to sell off the Port of Dover to the French, Chinese, or whoever. And for the people of Dover, the key asset that Dover has is the port and the White Cliffs. And part of the White Cliffs are actually owned by the port. So what we were talking about in the minds of the people of Dover was selling off the port and the White Cliffs overseas. And people in Dover are very proud of their heritage, very proud of the White Cliffs. They regard themselves as the custodians of those cliffs which to so many people are the heart and soul of our nation, about our nation's struggle to survive just half a century ago. And so they regarded this with horror. And they also regarded it with anger because they felt that the port belongs to them. And they felt that the port and the White Cliffs should remain forever England. So I had an immediate problem. What was I going to do? I could march up and down the harbour front and say, outrageous, no sell-off, no privatisation. But I had a couple of problems. First of all, we're going to be a Conservative government, and Conservatives believe in allowing private enterprise and the private ownership of assets. So I thought, well, that's not going to go over very well. I'm not going to be able to win that argument. So I thought, well, what do we do? And I thought, well, I know. Let's buy it ourselves. And so put together the whole idea of the People's Port, that the community buy the port and hold it in trust to keep it forever England in perpetuity. And that means that basically the people of Dover and the Dover district would be able to own a share, just paying £10 in a mutual that would own the port. Now, it doesn't take very long to work out that if you get, say, 5,000 people sticking up a tenner each, you've raised 50 grand, and that 50 grand doesn't really quite stretch to a port because it's worth about 200 million. So that wasn't going to quite work either. So then I sort of sat down, scratched my head and think, well, how do we have a community-owned port? How do we find the money to buy it off the government and for them to let us have it and own it and enable and facilitate the community to take ownership of its pride and joy and the key infrastructure asset, which is responsible for most of the jobs and money in the area? How do we do that? So what I did is I went down to the city and raised £200 million in finance. And then you say, but hang on, you've got a massive mortgage here. I mean, you're talking a mortgage of like 99%. How's that going to work? It's like the worst excesses of the Brownite sort of mortgage area in Northern Rock, sort of writ large. And the answer is that the payment of the mortgage will be satisfied by the income from the ferry companies. So it was essential to get the ferry companies, who are the key port users, give the port pretty much all the money it has, essential to get them signed up and committed to a long-term agreement that they would pay the mooring fees, which in turn would pay the finance. And that really makes a difference, because one of the oddities about financing is that the rate of return demanded for infrastructure is a lower cost of funds than the ferry companies themselves could get in the market. And what this meant in turn was that basically the ferry companies would be better off in terms of the mooring fees. So I was able to say to the ferry companies, you will have a lower set of mooring fees than if you raised the money yourself. And if the port gets sold off, the return on equity is going to be more like sort of 8 to 10% real, whereas the return on finance on an infrastructure asset will be 2% real or less. So that would have immediate implications in terms of how much the ferry companies would be expected to stump up in mooring fees. So they worked the numbers and realised pretty rapidly that instead of the harbour's plan to raise mooring fees by a third in a time when trade was reducing, revenues were reducing for the ferry companies, rather than raising the mooring fees by a third, they would instead be flat. And they could see this and see the numbers really worked, so the businesses were signed up. And then I sort of said to the community, look, we can buy the port, got the ferry companies signed up, got the finance raised in the city, in principle raised from banks, they're up for this, are you up for it? So we held a referendum, because I thought, you can't call it a people's port unless you have the support of the people. So we had a referendum, and the referendum was 98% in favour of the community buying the port, and 2% were opposed. Now bear in mind that 10% of people in this country think that Elvis is still alive, and I have to say that's pretty demonstrative. In fact, I'd say it's greater than North Korean. It wasn't as good as Saddam Hussein, who won 102% of votes in his various elections, but I think 98% was pretty clear. This was absolute community consensus that this is what the people of the Dawber district wanted to have. There was consensus between the businesses that the Chamber of Commerce and the port users, the ferry companies, who were responsible for all the jobs and money in our community, wanted to see. And they wanted to see it not just because they wanted lower mooring fees and therefore less pressure on jobs at a difficult time for our economy. They also wanted to see it because they want to see the regeneration of Dawber. How many people here have been to Dawber? Okay. How many people think that it is, as it currently looks, a beautiful jewel in the crown of the nation? How many people think it could look better? From the sea, exactly. This is the issue. We could actually have a seafront there that is like Wharf Quays, or is like Southampton Ocean Village, or frankly is even like Portofino in Italy, except not quite as warm. And it could be an amazing, beautiful, beautiful seafront. And that used to be, before the Second World War, exactly that, a beautiful Regency town. And what a key part of this whole project is about, is it's about returning the civic pride to Dawber by getting the money together to regenerate the seafront, to make Dawber a real jewel in the crown of our nation once again, a place where you step off and you think, I've arrived in England, I'm in the shadow of the White Cliffs, this is a beautiful, amazing place, this is what the nation's border should look like. And if it happens, if we actually succeed in building the People's Port in Dawber, taking over that port, running it really responsibly, rebuilding the seafront and making it look incredible, the confidence bounce that you will get in that community, the self-belief, the civic renewal will drive the economy massively forward and give you a real boost of economic growth. And that is why infrastructure is directly relevant to economic growth and the pride that communities had them. Joe Chamberlain showed that in Birmingham. I think we can see that in Dawber as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Charlie. Just to let you know, we're now halfway through our panel speakers, and so you may want to tweet about what they've said about both of their communities, both of their campaigns. Really inspiring stories. The hashtag which you are encouraged to use by our colleagues at ResPublica is @res_publica RP Fringe. So if you want to share your comments with the world, you're very welcome to do so. Our next speaker is Howard Dawber, who's strategic advisor at the Canary Wharf Group. Howard's responsible for just about every aspect of Canary Wharf's external, community, public affairs, so we're delighted to have him. Howard, I think you've got a mic just down there.
I think I've got a mic here. Thanks. Well, this is an issue very close to our hearts because Canary Wharf started 25 years ago when my chairman and chief executive, who was then the director of construction for Olympia in York, was sent over to look at a project in London, which Margaret Thatcher had suggested that Olympia in York, then a Canadian company, should take a view on, perhaps get involved in. And he came to London and he took a cab out to the Isle of Dogs, and at that time that's pretty much the only way you could get to the Isle of Dogs. And as he drove through the areas which looked a little bit like something out of the Craze, and walked around the Isle of Dogs, he said, you know what, we shouldn't touch this with a barge pole. His chairman overruled him, and he ended up starting the construction on the Canary Wharf project. And 25 years later, we've now got a really successful business district, more than 100,000 people working there, and we've overtaken Frankfurt, and in fact the City of London, and become the premier banking district in Europe. But we couldn't have got there without infrastructure. And the story of how Canary Wharf has had to fund that infrastructure is really relevant to what we're talking about today, because the first piece of infrastructure was the Docklands Light Railway. It was a very, very cheap railway, but built in the traditional tax and spend way. The London Docklands Development Corporation brought in a private sector contractor and paid for a very cheap light rail system to be put pretty much on top of the old railway infrastructure that was there from the days of the dock. So there's a railway viaduct that runs all the way into the centre of town, and they used that and added some bits at the end and ran what was regarded as quite a cheap, in fact, a toy town railway when it first started. But when they came to extend the Docklands Light Railway into Bank, Canary Wharf was already under construction. They came and said, look, we need a contribution towards the cost of the bank extension, and we ended up overall paying £125 million towards that project. But it was basically, you know, look, you need this, we need this, let's do a deal, a straight contribution from the developer, not very sophisticated. And there were lots of other people who benefited from that railway line being improved, the extension, who didn't make a contribution. The next key piece of infrastructure was the Jubilee line, and in fact we were promised that the Jubilee line would be operational by the early 1990s, and it ended up finally being built in 1999. And again, after they started construction, the government came to us and said, look, we need you to make a contribution of about £400 million towards the Jubilee line, and we agreed, subject to the Jubilee line running at more than 30 trains an hour, to a good signalling system that will allow that capacity of throughput of traffic. And in fact, that's not what got delivered. So we then sued the government, won £125 million back, and then gave that £125 million back to the government and said, look, now go away and please put the proper system in. And we actually got heavily involved in the design of the signalling system, far more involved in, you know, railway projects than we ever wanted to be. And then came along Crossrail, and it took us 8 years to persuade the Treasury to have a meeting with us on Crossrail and to take up our idea of us contributing towards the cost of the railway. I remember it was in the final days of the previous government, or final years, and we sat down and the government said, okay, well, we'd like you to write a cheque to support Crossrail of £1 billion. And you can imagine the reaction of my colleagues, which was, well, it could be summed up as no. But it was rather rude in that. On two counts. One is we don't have £1 billion lying around. It's not something we keep in our back pocket just in case somebody asks us to fund a railway. And secondly, Crossrail is worth a huge amount to Canary Wharf, but it's not worth £1 billion right now. It'll be worth probably more than that over time, but not right now. So we came up with an alternative solution. We did three things really. One is we said, okay, we'll redesign your station because your station's been designed by several committees within DFT and Transport for London, and you've quoted it at 1.2 billion cost in total. We reckon we can get that down to £1 billion just on your design. But if you let us go away and redesign the station, we reckon we can get it lower than that. So we went away and came back with a station 500 million, so half the cost that the government had originally intended. We then said we will chip in 150 million ourselves. That's our contribution. We'll also get some of the other developers around here, including a joint venture we were involved in, to put in another 100 million. So that's half the cost of the station gone off the 500 million. We'd like you to pay the other 250 million at the end of the project when the station's operational. So when we've delivered it on time and on budget, then you can pay the other 250 million. But if you can't, if for whatever reason the government doesn't have that 250 million, we'll turn that into a lease so you can pay it back, you know, the same way as renting a building over time. And then eventually it'll revert to you when you pay the lease off. Because a railway is a piece of infrastructure that's going to last for 50 years, 100 years. It's not something you want to finance over 5 years or 10 years. But the other thing we said, because we thought, well, we're putting 150 million quid in here, maybe there's something we can do to make some of that money back. So we said, the other thing we want is we want the right to build some shops on top of the station. So we're building 4 stories of retail, 100,000 square feet of retail on top of the station. Now let's try a little test. There are a good dozen or so completely new or substantially rebuilt stations on the Crossrail route. How many of those do you think somebody's put retail on? 1. Ours. There's not a single other station along the route where anybody's put significant extra retail. There's a huge new glass box going on the side of Paddington with no significant extra shops in it. There's a new station being built next to Excel at Custom House, which at one point didn't even have escalators in the station as planned, because all of the emphasis on the way that the Treasury was looking at the project, and pretty much any transport infrastructure project, you know, the transport bit's easy, it's a Treasury project, and it's the Treasury bit that's always difficult. It's been looking at how do we make this as cheap as we possibly can by cutting the size of the station, cutting what it does, making it as easy to do as possible, rather than how do we make it as cheap as possible by looking at adding an extra value. And that's why we have been arguing for some time that, and I guess it's easy for us to say because we are new, we've created something that wasn't there before, so all our infrastructure has been new, and all of it has been something where we can directly see how it's benefited us. But we've been arguing for some time that the issue that George raised, look at the undeveloped value when you put in a new piece of infrastructure and the value that unlocks, and look at ways in which you can capture some of that value and feed it back into building the infrastructure in the first place. That's something we believe in, and we expect to contribute towards infrastructure. We expect, because we know we're going to make money out of it. We don't expect the government to provide for us, but we would like to work on mechanisms to make that easier, so that the next piece of infrastructure we build is one that's going to not take 8 years to arguing with the Treasury to let us go ahead and build it. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Howard. And now to Rebecca Evans. Rebecca is editor of Construction News and has positioned Construction News as a champion for the industry and a critical friend where necessary, and is strongly backing the Creative Britain Futures and Construction for Growth campaigns to ensure that the construction industry has a greater profile. Rebecca.
Thanks. They just trip off the tongue, don't they? So, can you all hear me? So I don't have any big stories to tell about things that I've been involved in personally, but what I wanted to do really was talk about infrastructure both in its fairly traditional sense in terms of civil engineering, so building roads and bridges and railways, and also in its broader sense in terms of the social infrastructure that the construction industry contributes to and provides. And then I just wanted to give one much smaller scale example of, where a contractor, construction firm, is working with a local authority to do something that is enabling a fairly small scale scheme to get off the ground, but one that otherwise wouldn't do so. So just to start with the sort of civil engineering type infrastructure, I think, as is evident from the number of people in the room and the amount of time that's been spent talking about the importance of infrastructure at this conference and indeed at the other two party conferences, I don't think anyone is in any doubt about the benefits that investment in infrastructure brings. And it delivers obviously not only a long-term asset that benefits a community or communities, but in its construction phase and beyond it brings huge economic benefits. So talking about the sorts of campaigns that the industry is using to try and get its message out there, the kinds of figures that they're giving out are to say things like that for every £1 invested in construction, it's estimated that it generates £2.84 in economic activity, and for every 92p of that pound invested in construction stays in the UK. And obviously there's all the benefits that come with construction providing jobs and how quickly those jobs can be got off the ground when projects begin, particularly in things like house building. The other thing to say is it is really a powerful force for social mobility, so it has those benefits as well. So those are the kinds of messages that the industry is putting out there. In general, obviously in how it communicates with its local politicians, national politicians, and through campaigns such as Creating Britain's Future. Actually, there's a branding sign on the library there for the Creating Britain's Future campaign. And construction for growth. I can't say it myself, you see. So I think the government and all parties are now hearing this message loud and clear, and obviously that's why we've heard the announcement of a lot of schemes to boost construction work and infrastructure in particular. Chief among these is the UK Guarantee Scheme, which was announced this summer, and also the publication of pipelines of construction work. So these are things that the government is saying will make a difference. The UK Guarantee Scheme is a pot to support up to 40 billion worth of projects that are nationally significant, that already have planning permission and could be ready to start within 12 months. And the only thing that's stopping them getting off the ground is a lack of finance. So it's about the government stepping in really to back that. So there's potential benefit there, and the construction industry has certainly welcomed the scheme. The Treasury has intimated that it's had 40 or 50 applications already. But there are also concerns that that kind of scheme could create perverse outcomes in terms of raising the cost of finance for other schemes that don't qualify, and also the risk that some of the schemes that do qualify actually probably could have got funding in other ways, so whether that's really the best use of the money. I know a few eyebrows were raised when it was announced that the first scheme that's going to get backing under that scheme is for cross-rail rolling stock, when I think everyone thought that was actually being bid for already and didn't really need that, the government to step in that way. So there's a balance there between spending the money that's available and not skewing the market in terms of the cost of finance for other schemes, not detracting from smaller schemes. And I think that's the other thing as well, to say that infrastructure is often thought of in terms of big, shiny projects, but actually there's a lot that can be done and can again be done quite quickly, particularly at the local level, that's much more mundane in a way, that's around repairs and maintenance of roads rather than building great big new ones, and those things make a real difference to communities, but again finding the funding for them is very difficult. Of course, the thing that would make a really big difference very quickly is a genuine expansion in house building. But I think that problem still hasn't been solved unless there's a genuine expansion in the way that mortgages are provided, or unless the funding for lending scheme is used specifically around that purpose. The other things that the government's announced, new buy and those kinds of things, they're welcome, but I think they're really about tinkering around the edges. So obviously what the government isn't going to do is increase public sector construction spending. I think we'll see some new schools, nothing like we did previously, but they are in the pipeline. But not a lot else, really. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about visibility for the industry, because I talked about those small schemes. So the government now is publishing a pipeline of projects that it will fund over the next, or public sector that it will procure over the next 2 years. There's a real need for local authorities to come forward and do the same, and that doesn't appear to be something they're keen to do, which means that they don't get the infrastructure or the benefits that they need, and the construction industry can't position itself to really provide and prepare for that work. But I just wanted to end with, as I say, a small-scale example, thinking about people working together and trying to find innovative ways of funding schemes and getting them off the ground. And it's a scheme that announced last week by the construction firm Wilmot Dixon. Essentially, Wilmot Dixon has announced it's going to partner with Westminster Council, and the end result via a land deal is that the council will get a £17 million leisure centre at no cost, or essentially no cost to the taxpayer. And the way they're going to do that is the council is going to release some land for no charge initially to Wilmot Dixon. Wilmot Dixon is going to build 120 homes for sale. Once it sells them, it's going to use the money raised to cover the cost of providing the leisure centre. It's going to pay back the money for the land, and it's still going to make a profit. And of course, the community not only gets 120 new homes, but it gets that leisure centre that otherwise just wouldn't happen because there's no funding for it. So, as I say, it's a small example, but it is an example of how in individual areas there are pockets of activity and things that can still be done to get things off the ground.
Rebecca, fantastic. Thanks very much indeed. That concludes our 4 speakers. Terrific presentations. I'm keen to get as many questions or comments in as possible before we have to close the discussion. So I'll come to this gentleman here on the aisle and then go to the 2 that I've got here.
I'm Christopher Sills from Hackney North. I am very critical. We've been in power for 2.5 years and there's been too much delay. We have kicked the airport thing into the southeast into the long grass, whereas in fact if we dealt with it now we would be able to start within say 6 months. If with the energy crisis we have done nothing about it. There is, I understand, permits for gas stations, for gas-fired stations. Why aren't they being started now? And as for rail, well, the way we've dealt with what we have not done and what we should be doing is looking at innovative ways of building it. I mean, there's a line proposed from Oxford to Bedford, I believe. Can't we get the private sector to build it, own it, for the next 50 years, and do something like that?
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to take questions in groups of 3, so I'll come to the gentleman just here.
Fortuitously, my question is actually related to the previous speakers. My name's Nick Bryce, I'm from Leicester South. I'll tell you a little story. There's a village in Leicestershire called Elphicke, which has a bypass built past it. And I was particularly thinking of Mr. Freeman's remark about Thetford Forest. There was a colony of newts discovered there. It cost them an extra £40,000 to build the bypass. And given that all of the Conservatives were sort of attacked by badgers on Sunday, you've all ignored the fluffy animal brigade, environmentalism. You know, these political problems matter, and you just it's not a problem. How are you going to deal with that?
Thank you very much indeed. And the lady here in the front row.
Hello, Agnes Fletcher, HS2 Action Alliance. I was very struck by the panel's comments on local and regional regeneration, talking about infrastructure in terms of housing, broadband, and also the importance of good regional travel links and integrated transport strategy, roads, aviation, rail. Mr. Freeman also talked about us not necessarily having the public funds to do many of the infrastructure projects that we might want to do, but where taxpayers' money is involved, we obviously need very judicious use of that money and sound business cases. And £33 billion of public money is proposed to be spent on High Speed 2. The Public Accounts Committee has essentially rubbished the business case put together by the Department for Transport, presumably on the back of a nicotine patch or something like that. And I mean, the HS2 Limited's own figures show that 75% of the jobs created by HS2 Limited would actually be in London once again. So in terms of that rebalancing of the economy, not great benefits there either. The previous speaker talked about, talked about integrated transport strategy. We're cracking ahead with HS2 in advance of major decisions on where we'll create extra air capacity, which seems a problem as well. So I just wanted to say, really, it picks up some of Rebecca's points, that when we are talking about 33 billion, I know Howard Balk took 1 billion, we're talking about 33 billion potentially to spend on infrastructure projects. There are a huge number of shovel-ready projects all around the country, not just benefiting the major cities and particularly the dominant city of London, that are ready to go now, creating jobs and spreading the benefits around the country. My main point is I think we need to think again about the business case for HS2 Limited and whether that's the best use of public money in terms of the major infrastructure projects in this country.
Thank you very much indeed. 3 great questions. Christopher's on delays and the speed of reform, Nick on environmental groups, Agnes on integration, and I think you've also raised the issue of HS2, which I'd really love the panel to talk about. Charlie first.
I sit on the Public Administration Select Committee, which basically is about paperclips and government and how it works. Let me be really clear, I'm very radical on this, and all 3 questions effectively fall into the same pot. You're all asking exactly the same things in different ways. And that is, why does everything just take so long and get so muddled and just upset everyone in the way we deal with infrastructure projects, planning and development? And I'd like to propose a radical solution. It is better to act quickly and look after people properly than to get everything perfectly right and take forever about it. So I have a radical proposal, a radical plan, and I'd be interested to know what people think. Number 1, on a change of government, you change the top 1,000 civil servants, like they do in America. Gives you 2 months of chaos, 5 years of government where you can actually do things and not have inertia, stonewalling, misbriefing, and legal and regulatory issues. Number 2, that we dump most Euro laws and European human rights and all that sort of nonsense and carry on that delays us in what we do and overregulates our country. Number 3, that we drastically limit judicial review, judicial activism to what you might call manifest error and not just have you tick box the entire consultation process. And number 4, I know you don't like HS2, but let me ask you this question. Would you prefer to be fighting this for 10 years and have 10 years of planning blight and eventually it'll all go ahead anyway and you get 90p in the pound compensation, or would you prefer something happens in a year and you get £1.20 in the pound compensation for the disruption to your life on the line? And I think if we're going to do projects, we just get on with them. We compensate people. Yeah, we compensate. What I'm saying is, we compensate people properly, make the business case. Yeah, and I understand that. What I'm saying is, where you have substantial infrastructure developments, be it an airport, be it a railway line, be it a large planning development of a town, I think you're better off dealing with it quickly, not subjecting people's lives to planning blight for years and years, and compensating them over generously. It would be better for all concerned to actually do that, rather than have years of people digging in, fighting, delays, the whole thing just causing mass upset for years and years. Now I understand people on the line and in the subject to development will say, I don't want to move. The other issue... Okay, and then the other issue on the business plan, I don't disagree with you. And a clear business plan should be set out, should be debated quickly and effectively, and that plan should be very clear and transparent. It's a matter of principle, and people should be able to discuss it and debate it, but it should not drag on, because people need certainty, people need infrastructure, and also people need to get on with their lives.
Thank you very much indeed, Charlie. I'd love to bring one of you back, one of the 3 of you back at the end, once we've heard from all 3, because it's a very, very big question, and it'd be great to hear your thoughts on what you're about to hear. Howard.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that part of the problem is that second guessing, that you start with a fairly clear concept, and then we spend so long talking about it that the costs wind up, the costs of delivery wind up, and you actually end up Crossrail being a good example. Crossrail was originally postulated by Isambard Kingdom Brunel in 1840 as a way of linking the Great Western to the Great Eastern main lines, which was it was one of his thoughts. Why don't we just do a line across London? That'd be useful. It took us till the 1940s for it to come back with a study that said no, we should really do this, and then there was an attempt in the 1980s that was killed by Treasury. But even after it had been killed by Treasury, the project limped on, spending several £million a year, not really going anywhere. And like I said, the latest iteration of Crossrail started in earnest in 1999, the current instance of Crossrail. We actually got involved in changing the route, because the route that they were proposing in 2000 didn't go to Canary Wharf, and obviously we wanted it to come to Canary Wharf. At one point they were saying, it's not going to come to Canary Wharf, but will you still pay for it? Which was an interesting suggestion, which we declined. But it's taken to now to get it properly under construction. It's not going to be open until 2019. It takes half the time and costs half as much to build railway infrastructure in North America, and that's crazy. HS2, I don't. Having met you and heard how eloquently you make your case about the costs of HS2 and the route and so on. I don't know enough about it to say whether it's the right route or the costs are right. What I do know is that we do need a high-speed railway between London and Birmingham and Manchester, and we need it now, as soon as possible. And even if it does cost 20 billion, 30 billion, that's probably money well spent. However, it doesn't all need to come from the public purse, and we need to make sure we've got the route right, and then we get on with it, as Charlie said. But to get into this situation where, like we did with Terminal 5, we end up with 10, 20 years of discussion about whether it's going to happen or not, and then it happens anyway, doesn't do anybody any good.
Howard, thanks very much indeed. Rebecca?
Well, I think there's a link between the questions there, really, in terms of big schemes, small schemes, and how quickly they can be got off the ground. I mean, obviously something like High Speed 2 needs to be properly worked out. And everyone needs to be sure that the figures are correct, or at least that they can be interrogated properly. But there is a balance to be struck between a big project like that and things that can actually be done really quickly that would bring economic benefit, particularly outside London, very, very quickly. And I think actually, to your point about environmental type issues, actually working with regional and local contractors from an early stage, forming partnerships, actually it's much less difficult to tackle those kinds of issues because they can be worked in at an early stage, and it's not about a big clunking project that will take a long time to deliver. But I also think it's important thinking about the big schemes that make a difference. Howard's obviously talked about Canary Wharf. I think
we needed to, and still do need to, be rather honest about the profound disruption of the economic crisis which has happened, and the way it changes a lot of the assumptions on which we are planning and were planning for government. And I think if we're honest with the public and say this changes a lot of things about our assumptions about cost of capital, about what we in government can afford, we're going to have to deal with this structural deficit. There's no choice about that. I think infrastructure would have and should have and still can play a very radical part in it, and we've heard here what's possible. And I'm very frustrated. On HS2, I don't think it's a question of either regional rail network improvement or strategic links up and down. I want both. And what really worries me is the procurement and tendering story from the DfT and the danger of that writ large and repeated. And having heard this story, I would want that route looked at, and I want to make sure that we haven't missed a trick of doing exactly what was described here on Crossrail. Could we turn 30 billion into 20 billion, and then could we get private sector money to fund half of it, and could we develop stations along it, and could we have a corridor of really high quality growth that people are proud of as a legacy, and reduce the bill for the taxpayer and increase the speed and the private sector involvement in doing it. I worry about this model of waiting and waiting and waiting, and then government does it all. Much better to open up and do it more innovatively. And I think the answer to the Newt's question is to localise. I think when you have national government deciding and having a consultation, informed, as Charlie said, by every bit of European, there's an open season for every complainer. When it's done locally, when the East Anglia Railway Company, I want to be a shareholder in it, I want my councils to be shareholders in it, I want people locally to see it as an engine of sustainable growth. It's much harder for the little Snodgrass Newt Brigade to stop it if we are all locally for it and invested in it, as in the Dover Company.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. We've probably got time for one or two more rounds of questions. I'll come to you in a moment in case you want to respond. So I've got the lady here, I've got the gentleman on the aisle there, and I've got the gentleman right at the back. Agnes, if you want to briefly just respond to what you've heard, we'd be happy to hear your thoughts very, very, very quickly.
Well, just briefly, I mean, a bit confused by Mr. Elphicke's comments. I seem to be saying that never mind whether the business case or stacks up or not, press ahead, and that puzzles me rather, because I think what we need really is a strategic look at infrastructure that looks at what can be done about creating a genuinely integrated transport strategy across rail, road and aviation, but also looks at the investment we need. We're talking about very long timescales with HS2. We don't have high-speed broadband rolled out across the country. If we look at the change that there's been to working practices in the last 10 years, by 2026 into the 2030s, the 2040s, by the time this thing reaches Scotland, will 20 minutes off journeys here and there be the most important thing? You know, shouldn't we be looking at high-speed broadband? And just to go back to the business case, 55% of the benefit of HS2 is based on the increased productivity of getting people in a relatively small country somewhere quicker. And it's based on an assumption that no one does anything productive on a train. That's the base. And then you, of course, if you say, well, we've saved you 20 minutes of business time, and you do a calculation based on that, that's 55% of the business case. Now, that just doesn't stack up for me. If I take a train, I look around and I see people quite grateful for a bit of time, hunched over their laptop or their BlackBerry and making good use of that time. So that's an example of how full of holes this business case is. And all I'm asking is for an integrated look at infrastructure projects, an integrated transport strategy, and proper scrutiny. And the Public Accounts Committee has done it. As I've said, it's rubbish the case. But you know, if you think you know about HS2, and I know you said you didn't, Howard, please just have a look at the detail.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. The lady in the aisle.
Mary Brown from Sherwood. I really just wanted to make a comment, and I agree with Charlie Elphicke about the European legislation, because it is actually European legislation that causes the newt problem. The newts are not common where they make the legislation, i.e. Europe, but you can turn up every stone in this country and find a greater crested newt. And, you know, those are the people that get in our way, and let's...
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, just here.
Nicholas Bates, Kensington, Chelsea, doing some work at City University in connection with something. In Europe, there's growing interest in the wider benefits of PPP. Have you any thoughts about developing the wider benefits of PPP? And just connected with that, do you think there will be, would you advocate a third runway at Heathrow within 10 years?
Fantastic. Thanks very much indeed. And the gentleman in the back row.
Roland Furby from North Yorkshire. The idea that intrigued me was replacing civil servants. The disadvantage, I think, with them is a lack of scientific understanding. I think of an infrastructure project that was delivered very rapidly on time was opening up the Selby coalfield and building Drax power stations about 40 miles away from us at Seed. It provides a substantial proportion of this country's electricity. The only thing that makes it inefficient is having to burn sticks and dried grass. When it's ticking over, it burns 1,000 tonnes of coal an hour. When it's running flat out, it burns 10,000. How on earth can you replace that with sticks? They take the sulphur out by scrubbing the gas and get 2,500 tonnes of gypsum for the building industry every day. The carbon can be taken out when they get the technology in place. It's supposed to be killing the Black Forest. When we were at school, they taught us that it was the dirty lignite in East Germany that wouldn't burn properly because it wasn't proper coal that was killing the Black Forest. If our civil servants and opinion formers had a bit of a scientific background, they would have questioned all the restraints that have been put on coal production in this country.
Great. So, Norman, essentially the question is about the sort of scientific literacy of our officials and civil servants. We had a question here about public-private partnerships, and we had Mary, essentially a question about Europe, but a point about Europe, I think. George?
Yeah, well, huge sympathy for the point about Europe, and I think there's a point in there about one size does not fit all, and legislation needs to reflect the reality on the ground. apropos of which, I think very often we in Britain do legislation as if rural and urban areas are the same. And for example, on planning, I don't think our approach to planning in the shires should be identical to our approach to planning in the cities. I think cities in Britain are crucibles of innovation and growth and diversity and experimentalism, and architecturally they are places where you naturally want to see experimentation. I think a lot of our villages and our market towns are different, and the model to get growth there needs to be different. And I think in my constituency, most of my villages would love to have 20 or 30 houses if they were looking a little bit like Norfolk houses with a bit of flint and a bit of brick. And I think we could be a bit more nuanced about different areas of the country. Yeah, I completely agree with your point about science and rationalism in government. I'd better not talk about having been a PPS at the Department for Energy and Climate Change and having studied climatology at Cambridge 20 years ago. I think that the climate debate needs us in Parliament to be much better informed about and actively aware of and fed really open science, and the debate needs to be informed by the very latest science and the evidence, which is changing and complex, and we need to be honest about the nature of that and be on top of it. Yeah. What was the third question? Oh, PPP. Yeah. So I've used three other initials, but I think it's the same point, which is tax increment financing, which is what we were really talking about here. If you look at the American cities and the mayors there, over the last 20 years, the American cities have pioneered a model of financing infrastructure, which is essentially this. They say to government, look, if we built this thing, this dam, this road, this park, and we filled it with businesses and people and they pay taxes to the government, you're going to benefit. So how about we agree that you give us 30, 40, 50% of what you would have received, and we allow that to fund the infrastructure. And it's funded a lot of the infrastructure in American cities. I'd like us to do the same for good local authorities. It should be a prize for well-run local authorities, most of which would end up being conservative. If you can pay your bills, balance your budget, show that you're responsible, then we'll give you, in London, we'll give you the freedom to raise money that way. And I think it would be a huge incentive for innovative local government and begin the renaissance of civic localism that we want to see. The question of the London airport, I have no doubt that London needs more airport capacity. I think we need a really strategic look at how we're going to do it, where we do it, and how we link it to the rail link. And I think part of the argument on HS2 is that we are under capacity on entry into London at the key stations. But as I look at the map of London, I'm not sure necessarily it matters where it goes, but I know we need that capacity. If we're going to be a global trading nation and build this innovative economy, people have got to be able to get here quickly and get out quickly. And I think we need to think about joining rail and airport capacity up so that we have a genuinely resilient and modern infrastructure.
George, thank you very much indeed. Howard?
A couple of things. On Europe, I'm pro-European. We operate a business district in London which, if the UK were to leave the EU, would be significantly disadvantaged. We'd lose a lot of jobs. However, if you want to know what's wrong with this country's relationship with Europe, I urge you to read a thing called the Official Journal of the European Union. Because in there, amongst other things, there's an issue of that lists the contracts that are being let by government departments and by local authorities, and those that have to be presented in the OJU, so they're open to competition from Europe. A very, very high percentage of those contracts listed in there are from the UK, and that's because our friends and colleagues in other European countries just break the rules or get round the rules, and we don't. Now, sometimes the fact that Britain plays by the rules, the fact we have a very good legal system, we have a reputation for dealing very fairly, we have a reputation for being very open to foreign investment. You know, we've sold Heathrow to a foreign company, we've sold bits of our infrastructure and some of our major national institutions to foreign companies. That's a good thing. But where we are playing by the rules and the other people aren't, I think there's a real question there. And one of the things that holds us back is things like the state aid rules. It makes it very difficult for government to do things to encourage the business. So Europe in that sense, it's not necessarily Europe itself that's holding us back, but our slavish devotion to actually sticking by their rules, even when they don't. On PPP and how government creates a relationship with the private sector, one of the issues there is, and we found this with Crossrail when we were going through contracts, we found it in other things as well, that you're dealing with somebody in a government department who has never ever drawn up a contract like this before and is never ever going to do it again. So they've got absolutely no background on how to write a contract like this. And I guess from a private sector point of view, the best case for the private sector is the private sector can run rings around them and write a contract that's going to be very profitable for the private sector. But the worst case is that the contract's bad and it doesn't end up being good for anybody. The worst example of this was the PPP on the Tube, the London Underground, which was put together by Gordon Brown and Shruti Videra. That contract, the contract documents arrived on a pallet of documents. There is no way that one human being could actually read that whole contract and understand it. And not surprised, it's specified down to the nuts and bolts and the timing of cleaning and stuff like that. It was a ridiculous contract, trying to micromanage the way that the private sector would interact with the Tube. Instead of, look, we need a new tube, it needs to do this, you know, have fun, go and see what you can do to deliver it, which is slightly more complicated than that, but that's where I'd start, rather than what sort of paint and which particular size of tins of paint should we use on this particular bit of the Northern Line stairwell down into Angel. And that's pretty much how complicated it was. Not surprisingly, it didn't work for the private sector, because one of the companies went bust, the other one got taken over, and it didn't work for the public sector either. What was the final question?
Europe.
I've done Europe and PPP. Oh, civil servants. Yeah, civil servants are not experts, particularly in things like construction. We had the experience of there was a recession in the middle of us building the Crossrail station. You may have noticed the recession, but one of the impacts of the recession was construction materials got really cheap. In fact, the price of steel reinforcing rods dropped by 75%. So we said, okay, that's great. We can now reprice our station because the costs have come down. But we did say to the government, just to check, has the cost of all the other stations been repriced on the same basis? No. And what would normally happen, although not all the contracts are in place, is a contractor would just say, well, this is the cost I agreed to deliver the steel reinforcing rods at. That's the cost I'm going to deliver them at, and pocket the 75%. So you do need to be quite canny. Something we do, which has always worked for us, is we have one guy on each job who is incentivised. His bonus, his pay, is just on the basis of the costs he can strip out of the project. And I don't know why on some of the government construction contracts, I mean, you could employ an agent, you could employ a consultancy to do it. Say, look, let's. And I know it does occasionally happen, but you know, you're only going to be paid on how much cheaper you can make this. So the incentives are all in the right direction rather than in the direction of how much can we spin this out and how much more money can we ask for.
Fantastic, Howard. Thanks very much indeed. I didn't realise that tube construction was so exciting and so interesting. We'll come to Rebecca.
Well, I'm going to start with the issue about civil servants, because actually I'm not convinced that all civil servants don't know anything about the science that they need in order to make the decisions that they need to make, or that they need to advise on at any rate. But what I think more importantly, at least in some cases, is that they, and often the ministers that they are advising, don't know how to make those arguments in public, either in a way that is well informed or in a way that the public can well understand. And I think you do see that. So you mentioned power, something like nuclear power, and where that's going in terms of nuclear new build. It ties in with all these other issues about those big projects, whether or not people believe they should go ahead. The fact is there's all this uncertainty around, and in the meantime, that's just bad for everybody. It means that people start pulling out, there's doubt, costs rise, and while they don't happen as well, the UK isn't either maintaining or developing the skills that it's going to need to actually deliver on those projects when they finally do come. So I think there's an issue there about communication. I think on PPP, from the construction industry's point of view, there absolutely has to be a successor to PFI, and indeed we all know that there will be. I think what will be interesting now, and I have to say I'm not optimistic in terms of the scale of change. It's been so long under review. You'd like to think that there's going to be some amazing change made to it that's going to iron out all the problems. I think we'll have to wait and see whether that is indeed the case, or whether it's basically been left for a while just to go cold politically, rather than actually being improved and ironing out the kinds of problems that Howard has just referred to. But of course we haven't seen it yet, so we can only hope for the best. What was the other question? Third question? Oh, on Europe. I don't think that I've got a great deal to add on something like that. Again, I'd echo the comments around the need for local consultation, but that isn't quite the same issue.
Rebecca, thanks very much indeed. And the final comments for this evening, huge issue, a great discussion. Charlie.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would just pick up on that, just different from what everyone else has covered, is I think that there is a substantial piece of work in costing how much the newt has cost us. And we joke about this, but actually I think it's a serious issue. And you're right, it is a European law, it's a habitats directive, and it's not just the newt. I'm in East Kent, my constituency is in East Kent, and next door there's a really great nuclear energy sector at Dungeness Power Station. And Dungeness A and B are coming to the end of their lives, they're going to be decommissioned, and everyone wants to have Dungeness C so that there can continue to be employment in Romney Marsh. But they won't allow Dungeness C to be built because it's by a man-made beach. And on this man-made beach grows some strange little plants that Natural England say are very important and mean you cannot have a nuclear power station. As a result, the entire local economy in that Romney Marsh area is basically going to implode. There won't be any jobs, there won't be any nuclear industry, there won't be any kind of future. And I think the balance of convenience has tilted too much in favour of the newt and little plants that weren't there 10 or 20 years ago, and we should be looking at people and communities and what people and communities need, and make sure that we balance our relationship with nature, not just say there shall be no development because there may be some particular rare species knocking around. Balance is just all out of kilter, and it is madness.
Charlie, thank you very much indeed. Just two quick parish announcements from me to close for this evening. The first is that this discussion tonight, as fantastic as it's been, I'm sorry we weren't able to take all of your questions and comments because we could have gone on for another hour, I'm sure. Ties in very, very closely with ResPublica's work on new economies and innovative markets. And if you'd like to learn more, you can talk to all of the ResPublica colleagues in the room, or go to the website www.respublica.org.uk. And secondly, the Fringe event for the first thing tomorrow morning at 10:30, as was, entitled Marriage, Changing the Forms of Debate, with a panel which I'm sure will have a lot of violent agreement. Bishop Nazir Ali, Matthew Paris, Tim Montgomery, Andrew Pearce and Philip Blond. A great discussion tomorrow morning. Will not be at 10:30 as advertised, but instead will be at 10 a.m. No doubt in this wonderful, wonderful environment for you tomorrow morning if you'd like to join the debate. So thanks so much for contributing to a fantastic discussion tonight. No doubt we'll hear plenty much more of this in the Prime Minister's speech tomorrow, and have a great evening. Thanks very much indeed.